Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Hello, everybody. TJ and I are here together to try to answer the question, what are the strengths and limits of the SIDES framework? By the SIDES framework, we're talking about what we've done a previous episode on of side ABYX, though we might get into it that there's some other not only ways that people are thinking about these sides, but even that people are taking that aren't represented by those four letters, those four sides. TJ, can you share why this has kind of come up and what you've seen, that has been so enmeshed in the side B community and how people are trying to wrestle through these things?
Yeah, thank you, David Frank. So in the past year or so, as we've been podcasting and as I've been engaging more of these conversations, I have increasingly come across people, usually in the side B community, who are saying that the sides language is problematic, that they lament the sides framework and they focus on its imperfections. I've even recently had one or two friendly acquaintances in the side B community say, like, we need to move to a different way of talking about this. So this conversation might be more for people who are in the side B community, or people who are pretty focused on understanding the side B community as a social movement or a social project. So it might seem pedantic to some in a certain way.
Yeah, if you're like, what is ABYX?
Yeah, I know.
What, then the rest of this episode might be a little confusing or just off-putting to you. But it's really, just it takes being in the community of Christians who are wrestling with how same-sex attraction is addressed, and are some really significantly different postures and what that means and what sexual ethics that they can roll out with as well.
Yeah, so true. And after engaging with these people and hearing some of their arguments, I wanted us to talk about this a little bit, because I think this is relevant to understanding the theological landscape, essentially, of what's going on, and thinking about even social categories, like why are social categories relevant or important, but also how do we handle this critique that's coming from our own community that this language is not sufficient for the reasons they have.
So if you're not familiar with side ABYX, but you like sociology a little bit, then this episode might be interesting to you.
That's true. I think in the end, you'll see that I'll just lay it out in the beginning. I think that the sides language framework is helpful. I think it's better. I think it's mostly good, basically. Like it's helpful. It helps us accomplish the ends of distinguishing and the ends of communal identification and the ends of kind of understanding the theological landscape. I see the sides language, the framework, as a sufficient, even if it's limited, heuristic device. And that means like a way of like a preliminary key or preliminary analysis or preliminary category that is embedded in the history of queer Christians, especially in the English-speaking world. I think it's mostly helpful, but I want to definitely give a fair shake, I guess, like a fair possibility for us to wrestle with the critiques and us to consider possible real ways forward. I'm planning on going through basically 3 sections in this episode. I first want to talk about what I understand as the strengths of the SIDES framework. Then I want to go through what I see as the key critiques of the SIDES framework. And then I also want to propose some possible alternatives, if that's the goal. And finally, I'm hoping we can talk about it a bit, maybe throughout the episode, but talk about kind of how we're reflecting on some of these points, these topics. So is that okay? Can I go forward?
Sounds great.
Okay. So these are what I see as the strengths of the SIDES framework. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, David Frank, but I see the SIDES framework as a relatively neutral way to talk about theological difference. For example, side A, side B, it's relatively neutral, right? Like we're not saying
It's not, that's the good side, that's the bad side.
Yeah, you're right. Not saying unorthodox. We're not saying the orthodox. We're not saying the affirming. We're not saying the biblical. Like, we're not doing that. It's a relatively neutral way, and that, in my opinion, aids for nuanced and charitable discussions. So I see that as one strength, because it reduces animosity. Like saying, "Hey, we're the heretics." Okay, like, not a way to have conversations typically, even if it's true. Not a way to have conversations. I think, and this will be in contrast to a critique that's coming later, I think the sides language points out true points of contention or opposition, like real differences in theological opposition that are actually there, like the real phenomena. People do not agree on some of these topics. People do not agree who are queer how to live out a faithful life. And I think having the sides language actually allows us to make general distinguishments between different perspectives or ways of life. A third strength, this language, as we talked about in our episode on the sides previously, it is indigenous to the gay Christian, queer Christian community in English-speaking world, right? We provided resources. Go check out our show notes on that episode. This is an indigenous discourse. It emerges from us in an attempt to be relatively neutral or fair when there was more connection between side B and side A people. So,
an example of where a non-indigenous term could be something like queer was initially used pejoratively from people outside the community to say, "Oh, look at those queer people," and then later the community then kind of claimed it and took it on and used it. But that's right. It's less indigenous than the side AB was folks at the, I think it was Gay Christian Network at that time, saying, "Oh, there's some divisions here between the gathering, and how do we talk about that?" So
and it's often helpful. It's helpful to have a tool to be able to talk about it, rather than just pretend it doesn't exist or something like that. I would also say that another strength is, I think sides is a simple word in English. Sides. You could imagine much more complicated words, and we'll talk about some options later in the episode. But I think that's relatively helpful. Another strength to mention is that the sides language allows new emergent positions to come forth, right? Like, potentially in the future, maybe there'll be a side E or a side D. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's space for more development using the sides language. Not infinite space, but I also don't think there's infinite possible positions on this topic. I think that's another strength.
And I think that strength, folks are like, wait, what? There's, again, ABYX, this is confusing. Because too often we do want to just simplify it, be like, oh, what I believe is right, and then those are the wrong things. And to actually say, oh, what various perspectives are there? Which ones do I find more alignment with? What do I see as the strengths of different positions or ways of thinking? And it just, by having a multiplicity instead of the typical polarization or binaries that we fall into, I think is really helpful. And
that's
something that did emerge after the initial side AB, which was, kind of this binary, that then developed out further. Though there's at times where I almost want to think of, like, I think there's certain points of difference that are more important than other points of difference.
I would agree.
Different people weigh those differently.
I would 100% agree with that.
And for example, some people weigh the gay identification labeling thing as just as, or maybe even more important than what your sexual morality is regarding same-sex sex. And so that's where people are like, oh, side B is so progressive. And then side B people who think that, well, no, the big thing, that the progressive move that we're avoiding or something is affirming same-sex.
I love that. Thank you.
Express things clearly.
Thank you for that reflection. I think you're so right on that. We do move beyond the binary by having the sides rather than, again, good, bad, or progressive, conservative, or whatever. Okay, let's move on to some critiques. One critique I've seen is that this is mostly from people who are critical of the whole conversation, but essentially that we're two sides of the same coin, or two sides of the dice, because we're not at, like, for example, A and B, we're not actually that different. I have a lot to say on this, but from my perspective, we're very different.
And even folks who might say, "Oh, side A," and I couldn't find it last time I looked, but there was what we would call kind of a side X organization that, and I forget, the Restored Hope Network. They were somewhere in there, and they had a thorough breakdown of the 4 positions on sexuality, and they made A and B kind of on one half, and then the Y and X, but they didn't use A, B, Y, X. They used different words to kind of name those 4 different categories, but they did line up with the same schema.
Oh, interesting. Okay, interesting.
Anyways, sorry. So the critique is, you think you guys are so different, but you're actually not.
Yeah, and then that's obviously there's a lot of evaluative judgment in how different we are or not. And there's more to say about that, but I'm gonna just move forward with this.
Yeah, keep rolling through.
Yeah. So another critique, and this is mostly from side B people who are very side A
friendly.
They're kind of on the boundaries between side B and side A. This is what I hear from this most.
So, and sometimes, just for fun, these might be described as side C or a third way type of position where they're trying to bring more of some type of peace between the side A and B camps. So their critique is...
Their critique is that, in fact, having the sides language, sides, quote unquote, is intrinsically too oppositional or like militant against each other. And first I want to say thank you. I'm glad you brought up side C, because part of this episode is to expose there are more sides, as you mentioned. But for me, I would say I think the sides are a reasonable level of difference, because in my opinion, from my side B perspective, there are true oppositions in the sides that are, especially between A and B, that are near to the heart of the Christian life. Like living a life of sexual holiness and discipline to God, in my opinion, matters very much. Just in the same way that how we use wealth, social systems, inclusion, exclusion, all of these things are important to what I understand God wants human beings to do in the world and live in the world. So I would say no to this point. And it's not too oppositional. It's reasonably oppositional.
And I know we were trying to hear your critiques kind of on rapid fire, but this one I think is a big one, that in terms of a side ABYX, it's, this side versus this side. What you do with difference is there's 2 ways to find kind of an ecumenical nature, or like to sow peace. One is you diminish your differences, and sometimes kind of interfaith gatherings will be like, well, everything we believe boils down to the same thing, that we should just like love each other. And it just creates this like, the differences aren't that big. Let's just focus on what binds us. Versus, I would say, the Jesus way of saying, love your enemy. I don't stop calling, like, the Roman soldiers killing, the Jewish people and the Christian people were in fact enemies. But Jesus is calling an enemy love. And I think that the way towards a kind of Christian disposition is following Jesus and trying to become more like him in his sacrificial love for enemies, rather than saying, oh, no, we don't really have that difference. We don't really have that big of a difference. And I just see this as something that happens in a lot of different spheres of our life, not just in this kind of small conversation. So that's why I wanted to just jump in there a little bit. That's excellent. It's really hard to hold difference with peace and understanding, and I mean, politics, neighborhood level, families, whatever. And it's something I'm still trying to work on too, of like, there's a love in clarity and being able to say, no, I actually do disagree with you. And we can keep having this conversation in peace and with respect, rather than being ambiguous. So that's just something I'm personally working on, is like being nuanced, but not ambiguous, still being able to clearly express where there might be opposition.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that, as you said, that enemy love is so key to it's a key part of the Christian ethical life, or the Christian ethical endeavor. And I think I sometimes wonder, people who worry about this, it's too opposition, too militant, if they have maybe they've seen different conversations go wrong. Yeah. But you have to have that. And it's one of the key planks of Christian ethical life. You need that enemy love in order to be a faithful Christian. And part of that includes engaging with your ideological opponents. And that's why charity, a hermeneutic of charity, is so key. It's hermeneutic of love in interpreting others and engaging conversations. So let me move on to next critique. Another one that I've heard at times is by having this language, the sides language, we mask our connections to other LGBT plus people, because we're kind of, this idea is we're becoming each insular little units separate from each other. I will say this depends on a certain assumption on who you consider your most primary belonging of people to be, right? If you consider your most primary people belonging to be the church, and the church is the historic church, the Orthodox church, whatever, you have a different relationship to what this question might mean. Like it puts what your connection to LGBT people plus people in a different light. Though for like me, for most of us, we see ourselves as belonging to multiple communities. So there's not tension. There's tension at times, but for me, following the Christian ethic and trying to follow Jesus in this ethic by the power of the Holy Spirit, that's the most important. Like that's very important, right? I see it as crucially important. And I see other LGBT people who are on that journey as closer to me than side A people, for example, or side Y or side X.
Mm-hmm. And if I can roll out the critique a little bit more, it'd be someone saying, like maybe it's on your Twitter description, instead of saying, I'm a Christian who's gay, you're saying, I'm a Christian who is side B. And it's kind of this insider language that non-Christians who aren't part of this AB whatever world now don't have that sense of connection with you intrinsically because of the words you're doing. So overemphasizing side A and B is masking the type of connection you'd have. And obviously in different conversations, you can use different words, but towards what you're saying, TJ, that, well, which connections are more important and when? And when, right? Like on your Twitter, when you're publicly speaking, if I'm talking with a bunch of non-Christians, I'm not going to introduce myself as, well, I don't introduce myself with my sexuality generally anyways. But if there is some gay or queer friends or neighbors, then I could make that point of connection. Yeah. So, but I wouldn't, you're right, I wouldn't do it with side A or B. But I also really sympathize, like I would not have gone to a gay Christian network gathering or queer Christian fellowship, but a side B gathering where it was like, oh, here I have more, my connection is not just the fact about, that I'm gay, same-sex attraction or something. Yeah. But it's, it's more robust grouping. So I do have a higher connection to that group. And it's only been really through, well, not only, it's especially been through my involvement in the side B community and then interacting with others who I have a close affinity with, who are also more connected with LGBTQ spaces, that I have been able to get more connected to there. I understand it's probably coming from folks who want to see other Christians ramp up that connection and continue to break down that division of like, it's the queers versus the Christians, and like, we need to strengthen that connection. So I can be sympathetic to why they're afraid of masking these connections. Each person will just have different roles in different spaces in which it makes more or less sense at times.
I think that's true, because we're part of both somehow, right? But
and even kind of what I'm jostling around or whatever connects to another critique that in the side B world, we have folks we mentioned the side C, or who are leaning towards the side A friendliness. We have people in the side B world who are very involved in maybe like a pride march to a certain degree. And we have people who are very opposed to that. So there is a variance within these communities, and when does it break out and say, oh, that's not side B or is side B?
That's complicated.
Even the confusion of, side B side A and B were specifically created to distinguish between same-sex sexual relationships, what you do with them. And now, because of its connection with the larger queer movement, there's the LGBT And
the trans conversation. Mm-hmm.
the trans conversation has not a ton to do with the conversation on what do you do with same-sex sexual relationships.
Yeah,
so
that's right. Even though as you said, we're united just because of the historical evolution of the larger LGBT plus movement in like English speaking countries. So yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot to say here. And I don't want to go over too quickly, but that is a critique of the side's language. So I move on to the next one. The next one that I've heard is there's variance in side B. And so just having one category can seem too, like it encloses too much. In my opinion, this is not a good critique because I think like side B is a centered set. There's key principles in the center which keep us united. And there's people who revolve around that. You can move away. If you reject those principles that we have right now, you're not side B anymore. But again, some people live on the boundaries and the borders between, and we don't have a, for better or for worse right now, we don't have someone who determines who is side B, right? Like we don't have a common creed or common confession on what side B is. It's just the description of a social movement. We're approximately like this.
I mean, either it's generally agreed upon. This is what it means.
It is there, but we don't have anyone to judge that. We don't have anyone who can punish them and say you're not like not
that TJ's recommending that there is someone to punish it. He's just recognizing.
I'm not recommending that. I'm just recognizing in the social movement we don't have a judgment function that would say you've transgressed too much. You're not part of us.
And this is at times why people have been like, oh, maybe we need a position between B and Y. And I'm like, I think that's just side B. You're just uncomfortable with some of the other people in the side B world.
Yeah.
And the fact that there's disagreements in the side B world doesn't, like side B hasn't actually become, it is still the umbrella that we're under. It's just, there's disagreements in the camp.
Mm-hmm. And it's not, I'm not saying I don't want side B as a movement to evolve in what I think are better directions, because I do. But I just don't think the sheer fact that there's variance in a social movement means the social movement's category no longer means something. Because I think side B means something. Check out our episode on unity and difference in side B. I list what I understand. We both list what we understand is the key pillars of what side B means as of now. So,
what other critiques have you seen about this sides framework?
Another one. This sides framework does not have meaning outside of our particular discourse. Like it's insider language, so to speak. And this is similar to the next one. You could also say it's jargon. But my question is to this critique, what words do have meaning outside of particular discourses? All words are discourse bound. Like you don't escape that. That's not a very good critique. Another one, jargon. I would say a lot of words that communities develop themselves start out as jargon, quote unquote, meaning they're not readily accessible to people outside of the group. But some of these words develop over time to enter more mainstream.
Can you
give me an example? Yeah, this is in Protestant theological discourse. So if you're not a Protestant, this may be new to you. But for example, I've seen this more in the US, but Calvinism and Arminianism, these are two theological positions which talk about multiple things. But one thing is God's foreknowledge, how grace works, and how the human will work. These are some of the things we're disagreeing on. I've usually have found anyone who's kind of theologically minded in the US who's a Protestant, they usually kind of know that this conversation basically, right? So it's become more mainstream, even though originally these were small movements being debated in university, like theological universities in Europe. So any word over time can become mainstream. It's possible. So the critique of jargonness, I think, is not great, even though I get it. For these small communities, you sometimes have to explain the words. But increasingly, I'm finding personally, in my contexts, which are kind of academic contexts right now, people are increasingly knowing the terms, right? If you say side B, side A, they're like, oh, yeah, okay, I know what that means. But I'm not saying it's necessarily spread down to every church in the US necessarily either. So I don't think this is a great critique. I think both of these are not great critiques overall. So, yeah. I have also heard this critique that US schools and other school systems in the world use letter grades to denote relative levels of value, like A, B, C. So the idea is there's a hierarchy, A is better than B. Okay. I'll mention this as a critique. I don't think this is a very strong one either. I mean, what's better? Numbers, 1, 2, 3? That still is hierarchy. And the fact
that there's it's not just ABC, but also there's a Y and X in there. Hopefully, break
Yeah,
people
I know.
out of the fact that it's like we're not. Yeah, it's not A through F.
Yeah, I know. It's not A through F. Another question you always have to ask, because I recognize it's easier to critique than create. So what are real alternatives to this sides net framework? And I don't hear side B people who are critical of the framework, of the sides framework, talk about this as much. So I've kind of prepared a list of what I see as possible ideas. I don't think these are very good necessarily, but they are possible ideas. Should I just go through them?
TJ thinking very thoroughly, like, okay, if people don't like the sides framework, maybe I can do the creative work of like, what are alternatives before we go to potential alternatives to describing it as A, B, Y, X, etc. Which of those critiques express concern that, you know, that you're like, oh, that's something to be concerned about. That there's some wisdom to be gained from that critique.
I think masking our connection to other LGBT people is worth thinking about. Again, I mentioned the oppositional thing. I think there's true oppositions. Other people don't, so they have a very different judgment on that. I tend to think that people should learn. Like, if you want to be involved in a conversation, you should learn the discourse. That's a pretty basic assumption for me. So I don't think that the jargon is that big, that critique. I would say that. So
the kind of opposite of the like, oh, that's too oppositional, making them as sides. The one you also said is like, oh, well, are they really that different? Are they two sides of the same coin? I think it's just important for us to be, you know, not just, oh, they're critiquing us so we're pushing back, but be evaluating and saying, oh yeah, there's some reasonable or understandable points that are kind of fueling this critique that are worth consideration, which is why you're partially going down, okay, well then let's think about alternatives. So give us a go. What are all of the alternatives that you've thought of?
Okay, one would be shifting just the word of sides, right? And I thought if side is seen as too oppositional by some, what are real alternatives? So I thought of a few: logic, stance, persuasion, conviction, position, perspective. These are all words which I see as broadly, like they're not changing the meaning much.
Persuasion A, persuasion B.
Yeah, but maybe they're less oppositional, which I think is a poor critique. But that if that's important to you, which I don't know, it's hard for me to understand why it is, but those could be alternatives. Because part of it is I think we could make more oppositional terms, like cadre, like a military unit, which is battling. There could be alternatives that are even more oppositional overall. One thing I've heard once, this was on a Life on Side B podcast, was the idea of just removing the sides as an alternative, the sides language. For example, saying I'm A or I'm B. I'm B, which for me doesn't make a full sentence. Like I'm A. Like, so what do you think about same-sex sexual ethics? I'm A. I can understand if you say I'm side B or I'm side A. I get that. But I'm A or I'm B.
Type A, type B, then it sounds like you're talking about blood, I guess.
And it's basically, it's the same thing almost as sides. Like type, it's not that different in my opinion. So.
And opposite of the, you know, there's those who are trying to decrease the oppositionality to try to bring unity among all Christians who have queer sexuality, experience same-sex attraction. And it's trying to, you know, let's decrease opposition, bring up unity. Though there's the other critique is that it's actually too neutral. You said that was one of its strengths of like, it helps have good discourse because it's not like, oh, those are the right people, those are the wrong people. And it's just like A, B, and then you get to think about these two positions side by side, or side B and Y. Okay, what are the differences? How do we think about these? And some would say that itself is a bad or a dangerous thing. You need to be able to explicitly say, that's the heretical position. And my brief response would be, I think there's times to say, explain neutrally what the side A perspective is, and then you can say whether you think it is the best thing ever or whether it is heretical.
Yeah. I mentioned that as a critique of they're two sides of the same coin, basically. I tend to think it's good to have relatively neutral language in communicating with ideological opponents, right? But that does not mean that you may not have strong evaluative opinions more generally, right? And you may, for example, you may not say, well, I think side A is heterodox, or I think side A is heretical, or side A person may say, I think side B is like life denying, or like whatever ideas you have. You can have those. But when you're communicating with someone who's trying to have real, nuanced, charitable conversations, I think neutral language is helpful. Well, relatively neutral language is helpful.
You can't just keep saying, "Well, the heretic says." Well, the heretic
I know.
says.
That's not gonna build a bridge of charity and understanding.
Okay, what's I like your next idea that you had talked about of an alternative to letters, side letters.
Here's another real alternative to the sides letters system. I was thinking, well, maybe we should draw on how Christian theological movements have often named their position or their group. So, for example, naming it after a prominent leader from a theological perspective. For example, Calvinism, Arianism, Molinism, Christianity even, Jesuits, Mennonites. Like, would we call ourselves Wesleyites because Wesley Hill is a somewhat prominent theologian in our Hillites or something?
And sometimes this even happens a little bit naturally within the side B world, that you have various authors. You have Bridget Eileen, who's written a book, and Greg Johnson, and they both are telling certain histories and stories, but they have different sensibilities. And so, like, are you more of a Bridget Eileen side B or a more Greg Johnson side B? Anyway, so
there's something true to that. Those are real kind of phenomena of sensibilities. Like, people are different in that way. Another one, Friends of Allred, who is kind of you might say a patron saint or something of our movement, from the spiritual friendship movement. That could be a question. I thought about it, and I actually don't like this naming system that much. Except I like Christianity, but it's not my favorite way of naming. Anyways, another one is to name after particular places that were prominent for Christian community or movement. For example, Cistercians, Carmelites, Anglicans.
I know Carmelites have to do with like Mount Carmel or something, right?
Yeah, Anglicans are like Christians of England. Cistercians was a community, I think it was named after a particular community in Europe, a community, right. And then the monastic order took the name. So another one is, what if we named after a sense of what we are theologically in contradistinction from others? And this one might be more possible. For example, some examples are Reformed, Catholic, Orthodox. A lot of communities name themselves in this way to distinguish themselves from others, kind of what they see as a key good. Another example could be traditional, biblical, historical. I think we basically already do this in some ways as a secondary way of categorizing ourselves. For example, sometimes you might say, I follow historic ethic, I'm a traditionalist. All those things are kind of in the mix, versus I'm maybe progressive or revisionist. I don't love this one because it can be binary and it can be more exclusive. It's more evaluative. It's less neutral. But I mean, I sometimes use I have the traditional sexual ethic, or I have the historical sexual ethic, and I feel fine with that. I'm happy with that. But that could be one other way of naming ourselves rather than the sides language. I'm not sure if it improves that much, but it is an alternative. So,
and in the Reformed world, there's sometimes what's called people who are like, oh, but are you truly Reformed? And they have a more narrow view of what that is versus those who have more of a broad Reformed kind of sensibility. And right now, I think there is more acceptance in the side B world of like, side B is really is able to be described more, but maybe in the future there will be disagreements of what's truly side B versus just the kind of open-handed way. And
in my opinion, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it just, we'll see how it develops as of now. A final one is, what if we named ourselves after theological positions? For example, if you said Chalcedonian Christian or Tewahedo Ethiopian Orthodox, these terms are after particular theological positions about how in Christ his natures relate. Like, I'm Chalcedonian or I'm Tewahedo. That's a very particular position that are from a location, Chalcedon, and Tewahedo is in Ethiopia. Is, I think, a Giz word about how the two things relate, the Christ's natures relate. That's another theological one that we could maybe talk about. I consider maybe the school of spiritual friendship, but I'm not sure. That's just another possibility. I'm not sure. It doesn't quite like sparkle for me, but it's there. A final alternative I've heard is use things that are symbolic and not typically meant to enumerate, but have no precise connection. For example, we are the Bs, which the Bs, if you don't know, is a meme symbol for side B. We can also say shapes, colors, I guess, like we are yellows or we're triangles or something. Of course, many movements in the world use colors, like Thailand, red shirts versus yellow shirts, to have a political designation. Also, in the African continent, many political parties use colors to distinguish themselves. Sports teams sometimes often use animals as mascots.
I'm not looking forward to going to a side B conference and everybody wearing the right color to.
I know. I haven't heard this much, but I have heard it as an alternative perspective for how to change the sides framework to these symbolic things that are not directly,
that are even more neutral and
I guess even more neutral.
In some ways, as I said before, I don't want to create language that fuels animosity. And so there could be an argument that say, well, we can set ourselves up better for, loving others, enemy love and such. But I think sides is neutral enough.
Yeah. Well, my question is, I have two questions, but my first one is, so from that brief description of some of the strengths and maybe possible limits and potentially possible alternatives, what is like sparking for you, David Frank? Like, do you see sides as sufficiently useful for our moment? Is there any alternative which really seems possible to you? Like, what are you thinking about all this stuff?
I think sides is sufficiently useful, and I do think recognizing various thought leaders as a way to kind of qualify that further. I'm obviously most familiar with the side B world, but we kind of do that. Oh, side Y are folks like Rosaria Butterfield. Side A includes people like Justin Lee or what's
Giacomo Sanfilippo.
Yeah. Sorry, there's a specific one.
Matthew Vines.
Matthew Vines. And Matthew Vines has a distinctively different version of side A sensibilities than other, I don't have a name on mind, but some other side A folk. And some of those are different enough that they are even identifying, oh, I'm actually not really side A. There's one blogger who said, I'm side O. TJ and I have begun to call the position side AA of a type of sex positivity that is
quote unquote sex positivity
that is just about consensual, loving, caring sexual relationships. Really, as long as it's given the intention and the care, then it can happen anywhere. It has nothing to do with covenant. It has nothing to do with marriage or monogamy. And that is such a radical departure from the kind of more historic Matthew Vines type of side A. It is worth a different description.
Yeah. So for example, from our guests thus far, Giacomo Sanfilippo would be side A because he's open to same-sex marriage and same-sex sex. He's opposed to polygamy. That comes very clearly to him. Clearly, if you listen to his conversation. Whereas our friend, Reverend
Tyler Sitt is at the very least more friendly to side AA and wouldn't rule that out, if not outright, would say, as long as people are being caring, then sex can happen anywhere, anytime. It's not limited to some type of monogamous covenant, let alone a heterosexual one.
Also, I think it's clear, but it's not limited to monogamy. It's not limited to marriage itself. When I talked with him, I understood him as saying that he'd be okay with people being sexually engaged outside. Like, that's not something to repent over outside of marriage. And also, of course, as you said, not heterosexual. So all those things are kind of
and so even there might be, Tyler Sitt may be more for people who are advocating one night sexual, one night stands is kind of what they're called, but he might be more hesitant to that than some other side A people who are like, as long as it's consensual and loving and you know yourself, then go for it. But they're still overall in this side AA category.
Sure. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. So you shared that.
So in that way, I am finding it useful and sufficient to start at least it's kind of keeping a bullet point list of different frameworks that people are using and being able to recall that in conversation and, how have you seen that develop over here? Or what are the impacts of that? How are people coming to those conclusions of those different sides? I I think it's helpful to have those different thought leaders that can kind of qualify it and flavor those. But I'm not interested in it becoming, I'm a Presbyterian and a Mennonite. So I sometimes half jokingly say I'm a Presbyterite or a Mennonitarian.
Mm-hmm.
And those connect me with, like this is a very focused and important conversation on sexuality for sure, but it's kind of a narrow thing. Like we're not talking about the divinity of Christ or how to like all these other parts of living out the Christian life and following Jesus. And so the Reformed camp, the Mennonite community are bigger communities that are still under the most important umbrella of we are followers of Jesus. And so I'm not interested in them taking on more robust of characters, though I like the idea a little bit of like, oh, it'd be kind of fun if it was like named after someone, but that can overly focus a person and
Mennonites
really
are named after someone.
No, I know. I'm saying in the side B world.
I see. Yeah.
That like, it's like, we don't really need to put Wesley Hill too much up on a pedestal. And I do feel a little funny of like, oh yeah, Mennonites were named after Menno Simons, and it's a little weird, but it also can bring certain personality or character into a community. It can have its strengths. It can kind of go bad, I'm sure. But yeah, as a theological position.
Well, I mean, did you see any of the other alternatives as like a real alternative to the sides language that would be notably better?
As you said, we are already using things like describing people's theological, biblical approaches as more traditionalist or revisionist or progressive. But yeah, those can be, I think those are still useful adjectives at times to describe what's happening, but they have their limits, and it's not as easy because you go between B, Y, and X, all who are holding onto the historic, traditional sexual ethic that sex is for marriage, as defined by a man and woman coming together in a one flesh union. And they're all in that way. How do you distinguish
traditional?
It? Yeah, they're all traditional. And yet there's some important differences in their sensibilities. So it's at times I do actually want to diminish those differences of like,
I know you do.
Guys, like we're all holding, we're not changing our sexual mores here, so don't freak out. But to actually start nuancing out of like, oh, why are they uncomfortable? Well, people on the sidewise school of thought, they may not call it themselves, but here's a group of thinkers that have these types of concerns. We've recognized a trend, a certain perspective, and we've named it. And it's just, it is insider language. Some people, if you've made it this far, I wouldn't be surprised if you made it this far and we're like, this is all confusing, this is all pedantic, how annoying. I get it. If you are not in the world of philosophy, you would be like continental philosophy, analytic philosophy. It's all about thinking and ideas, right? Well, as you dig into the ideas, there's histories, there's movements, there's methodologies.
And I'll tell you, they're very different too. Continental and analytic, like they're extremely different. But yeah.
But that's just jargon to an outsider.
It is.
And if you're not interested in those conversations, it's going to bore you.
Yeah, that's true. Let me ask you a final question before we wrap up. There is also this idea that perhaps what we should instead do, it'd be better if we just say, I'm a gay or queer Christian, and then made someone ask questions about our way of life, our theology, our sexual ethics. Like, how does that hit you as a possible better alternative compared to the sides framework as a way of engaging the conversation?
It's so hard to speak to this because every cultural community, even within the US, just receives these words very differently. So when you say I'm a gay or queer Christian, for some people that says very little. For some people that automatically implies that you have created a new type of Christianity. And you could say, well, that's wrong of them to assume that, and they should ask follow-up questions. But I don't think I can make such blanket statements across different cultures. We should be trying to speak the own, indigenous, vernacular of wherever we go. If I am in Minneapolis, I will speak differently than if I'm, I'm assuming, a small town in Kentucky, that I will have to ask my questions about how they think about things and realize that the nuance that I would want people to ask questions about would probably never happen. And that's to fault them. Yeah. Do I wish like generally all people or all Christians were more like TJ and just really great at asking questions and being nuanced? It's like, well, not everybody is, is poised in the world to just be so curious and thoughtful and nuanced. So that'd be cool. It's something that we can encourage in our communities generally, that like when you hear someone is Catholic, if you are a Protestant who disagrees with certain things of Catholicism, rather than just jumping to the things you disagree with, how can you ask them questions? How can you ask why they're Catholic, or what parts of Catholicism are important to them, or really shape their life and shape how they follow Jesus?
What I'm understanding is this: we shouldn't expect this to be easily feasible. This sort of just say I'm gay, at least as of now, I'm gay, queer, Christian, and have someone ask about, oh, what does that mean for you? Why are you doing this? In sort of a general way. It could be possible in specific small communities or groups or something.
I mean,
but it's not the normal way.
Steiger Ministries, who focuses on kind of the global youth movement, would generally discourage initial conversations even using the word Christian, because they think it communicates better if you say, I'm a follower of Jesus. I don't know if they're that specific, but they're just towards that, like, realize that really just religious words can be instant turnoffs, can instantly, you might be the most, religious high church, Catholic or something. And that can come up in just like initial conversations with people, emphasizing the God whom you are following, the Savior whom you love, and making it personal in those ways is going to be communicating and getting to where you want to go in a conversation better than if you're just using these identity categories that you don't know what they associate with that identity label. So if we can't be doing that even with Christian when talking to non-believers, I'm not presumptuous to think that I can do that with gay or queer, with people who aren't readily in that conversation. So
this is in contrast to the SIDES framework. So do you think this sort of perspective is better than the SIDES framework or worse?
Well, I just recognize that the SIDES framework is going to be primarily an insider community language. And for those who are interested in starting to learn things and discern things, then they should learn it. As someone is getting more involved in conversations on queer sexuality in Christianity, they will have to encounter this and learn it. And that's fine. But that's not going to be, I'm not going to be able to use it without explanation. Okay. So I guess I would say, I would actually say whatever words you use, you're going to have to explain them. If you just say, I'm a gay Christian. So I actually do think you should probably add on like some type of qualifier there. Wesley Hill adds on the word celibate. I might use side B and then explain that it means this theological position. One's emphasizing your practice. One's emphasizing the kind of theological position you hold. Technically, you could be a non-celibate side B person, and it's just because you're not faithful to what you believe. So I think it would be better if we lived in a world where you could not say very much and people would just ask you what you believe or what you're practicing or something. But I think that isn't feasible or practical. And
Got it. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us in this episode. We hope that you've made it to this point at the end. Let's let the conversation continue about this framework. Is it the best way to talk about the theological position, that categorize us? And if you have an alternative, what are the real alternatives? Like, what are the real alternatives that could be possible for this if we should change the language? Or if, like me, you think the language is generally fine and it's good to continue moving forward with this framework as of now. So let's keep the conversation going. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Hey, listeners. I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.